Theology nerds, I'm getting very near the microphone and talking in a low, soft voice because I know that when I tell you what's about to happen, you might leap for joy. You might swerve into another lane. Your theological imagination's just about to get overloaded with zestiness. Because this is John Cobb from Theology Beer Camp at the Hatchery in Redondo Beach this January.
Deep breath.
Oh yeah, dude. This is the John Cobb episode.
This was amazing.
Yeah.
This was so cool.
John Cobb came to Theology Beer Camp. And this is how you know John Cobb is a bodhisattva. And if you don't know what a bodhisattva is probably because you grew up in a much more conservative religious environment. But if you were John Cobb, who pioneered Buddhist Christian dialogue, because you're like 92 and you pioneered a lot of things, like first person to write an eco-philosophy, first theologian to win awards, book awards in biology and economics. Actually, I'm not sure how many people have won like research-based book awards in economics and biology in general, but he did both, and his primary interest is philosophical theology. Or you're not like the person who managed to take the necessity of God out of your philosophy in order to partner with the Chinese government to think about a developing eco-civilization there when they read a little article that got translated into Chinese. And you're like, yeah, process people are down to help everybody if you don't want to kill the planet. Like John Cobb also has developed a liberal logos Christology that is actually higher than other liberals, and it's amazeballs. And it's in a book called Christ in a Pluralistic Age that he wrote back in the day. Then he adds on to it in a book called Encountering Jesus. And then he just recently wrote a book called Abba that gets at a lot of those things in a much more general audience way. But there's also a chapter in my dissertation about it.
I'm not surprised.
You're not?
Not at all. Is the title of the chapter called Faniac?
No, that's not how. That was not in there. Though I was told upon first reading of said chapter that Tripp, I can intuit places you would like to give friendly critique, but I think you made you have a certain reverence towards JC that you're really going to need to take down a bit in order to finish this dissertation, which involves critical.
Yeah, that's tough.
I know.
That's tough.
I mean, it's like you don't say stuff like that about your mom. and JC, like,
I know
is
that's
one
hard.
of the nicest people in the world. Honestly,
but he would understand.
Of course he understands. He's a bodhisattva. And if you don't know what that word is, you should really Google it, because it's an interreligious affirmation that if you're an ordained minister, you can make towards someone who has so embraced the beauty in their wisdom tradition that they don't hold it for themselves but give it back over and over again. And John did that day. So he comes in. The first half of the talk is you're going to sit there and go like, "Oh, junk." He's like talking about education. He's giving what sounds like a really conservative critique to universities and stuff, and then he's like, "Oh, and by the way, I have some thoughts about Jesus too." So he sticks it to scientism, which is like reductive materialist science. He sticks it to the universities who just want to educate, not for values, but for profit. And then he's like, "Oh yeah, by the way, church, you should probably listen to Jesus." My favorite line, well, probably not my favorite, but at least one of them I remember, where he said, "Now I know I haven't read the whole Bible through recently," or something like that. But when you pay attention to Jesus, he has a whole lot to say about money and not a lot to say about sex. I mean, a lot to say about money. Like, you either have to pick God or mammon, and I don't know how ambiguous that is, but some churches think that's optional. Like, and you're just and then he made an observation in the middle of it. He said, God only talks twice in the Synoptic Gospels. At the beginning at baptism, where God's like, "This is my beloved, you should listen to him." And then at the Transfiguration, where God's like, "No, I'm serious. You should listen to him. And you should really listen to him." And he goes, "So I just agree with God that we should."
My favorite part is when everyone kept trying to out-Bible John Cobb.
Yeah, it was not going very well.
That's hilarious.
But so he gives this talk and then proceeds to get interviewed on a whole bunch of podcasts because honestly, you may not know this, homebrewed listeners, and that would mean that you just haven't connected all the dots. But I'm a JC evangelist. And, I got Jesus Christ. I'm down for Jesus Christ's first book. The Homebrewed Christian Guide to Jesus is about Jesus Christ. You may notice in the middle of the book how you connect the history and philosophy and the development of theology in the early church to contemporary ethical situations and pluralism and stuff is a chapter on John Cobb. It may be there, but nonetheless, I am support Jesus Christ, hardcore fan. You also know Homebrewed. We got a number of JCs, 4 of them. We also have Jack Caputo, right? Mm-hmm. We have Just Catherine Keller. Mm-hmm. And then you have maybe John Cobb's like the Godhead. Because when I'm encountering the other 3, I'm always encountering things I love in John Cobb. And it was all the questions and doubts and frustrations and things I had in high school when I started reading philosophy and historical Jesus stuff. And then in college when I experienced intense suffering, pain, and doubt that connect with Cobb, that then he gave me a lens to receive Jesus back. So maybe there's like a 4-way perichoretic dance. I don't know. But I'm just saying I have 4 JCs, 4 of them. And this JC, John Cobb, I'm evangelizing for him. So I'm like all these other podcasts. I'm like, y'all interview him because, I've interviewed John a lot of times. Mm-hmm. And I've gotten to the point now that when I interview him, I pick up conversations, having read a lot of his books, and interview him a bunch, that I'm thinking day drinkers at Theology Beer Camp are not going to follow.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like if I'm like, so there's a debate and process thought about the number of ultimates. Does the primordial nature of God's relationship to the forms constantly transform, or the forms stagnant? Or do you attach the forms to the mind of God? Like there are questions, not necessarily day drinking questions.
Yeah. That's morning coffee questions.
Yes. Sure. So like Newsworthy with Northsworthy interviewed him, and he asked questions that are totally fit for his theological acumen. And I had to go on and answer even more questions on Luke's podcast, which y'all should all go listen to it, by the way. I try to explain to him. Some people just are allergic to liberal Christians so much that they're like, I guess you can count as a Christian. And they think that's an affirmation. Mm-hmm. I want you all to know Luke's a Christian, even though he's still witnessing to me to switch religious teams. I just want him to evolve. Isn't that like the ideology of liberals? Like, you just want him to evolve.
Yeah.
I'm just not going to examine it, so it's not seen as critical. Anyway, and then Crackers and Grape Juice interviewed Cobb. Brew Theology interviewed Cobb. And if
Christian humanist.
Yeah, Christian humanist, but you should really listen to that Brew Theology episode because Dan, Brew Theology is helping host Theology Beer Camp in Denver on August 18th and 19th, which tickets are on sale right now, cheaper than they're going to be, so you better go ahead and get them.
Actually, this is the last day to get them at the cheapest price. So,
but don't tell them that because they're still a cheaper price for the next couple weeks. Mm-hmm. And we don't want to deter before they go up. You want to carpe diem.
That's right.
The beer camp opportunity. But Janelle asked this amazing question that if they have this conversation about religious practice and Eastern, Western religious connections, and I'm not going to ruin it for you because you should really just go to the Brew Theology podcast and hear it. But here, he's going to give a talk, and then after it, between all these other podcasts talking to John, I discovered that, one, I was just uncomfortable not talking that much at beer camp because I know that I was like, I put a lot of work into putting on this event, and there's John Cobb and all these other people are talking to him, and I got jealous. And so I said, and John's being really nice because he's a real Christian. And I thought, the Kingdom Pill skit where like the guy that does the Obama impersonation says all the junk Obama's thinking.
Yeah.
And it's funny. So I kind of decided I was just going to say all the things.
So here's the setup. John Cobb's up there. Each podcast comes up, asks a bunch of questions. Tripp is taking notes the entire time. And then after that podcast is done, before the next one gets up, Tripp comes up and just rants for 10 minutes about what John Cobb wanted to say, but was too nice to.
Yeah, or just I wanted to say, or and I will say this, that Nathan Gilmour, on the Christian Humanist podcast, put out part of the talk Cobb gives, and then obviously his interview with Cobb. And, he also put up me ranting about him on the podcast, and then decided to give me a hard time after it. I just want to say that I didn't realize this, but 2 of the things that were in what I was ranting about were based on crap people said on Twitter. And so then he's like, I didn't talk about that. So, just know, you would have to be a full participant in the John Cobb, Theology Beer Camp experience to know what was going on. And if you've ever had, Greg Stevens inspiring people on Twitter to give you a hard time at Hello Gregory, then you could imagine that I had things I felt like saying when I got the microphone, because I was trying to take notes and read Twitter and tweet back. And,
drink.
And I was running the taps that time.
You gotta
keep
the river flowing.
And that was near the end. And we had, we had this beer from Chapman, in Orange. Mm-hmm. It's a brewery, Chapman, that they made called The Voice of God in honor of Morgan Freeman. And we were Voice of God imbibing. Mm-hmm. And it was a deliciously dry, like packed dry hop where it just smelled like citrusy goodness. And so I was also filling up pint glasses what happened. So, I don't know how many of my what's going to get edited out. But yeah, it's all for the love of John Cobb.
Those rants, that's just a taste of what you're going to get in Denver and Oklahoma City this August.
Yeah. So go to Theology Beer Camp. And the other thing is, if you don't live in the middle of the states, because these are Southwest hubs, so you can get the summer fair tickets that are cheap, and go in, you rock it out at beer camp, you go out, and then you can tell us where we should go next, because there's a little form on there. You put your city in the most popular cities and stuff. Then, especially if you are like, I know a place we could host it, or I'd like to help organize this or that, then you put that on there, and then we'll be figuring out where we do Theology Beer Camp next based on those. And here's the other thing. I had a Twitter earlier today. Like, when you go to beer camp, you aren't buying beer during beer camp.
That's correct.
But you are tasting it.
That's correct.
You don't have to bring things. There'll be a plethora of glassware. Mm-hmm. That is beer style appropriate.
Yes,
as part of the swag bag for this, and we already know. And there's gonna be food and snacks and coffee and stuff. Mm-hmm. So when you're going to beer camp, you're not just getting a ticket for what happens. You're in karaoke time.
Yeah, I mean that's included, but
you're also you're getting an experience. Mm. And the best part of beer camp, actually, at least for me, other than John Cobb, but was the community side. Mm. So when you go to beer camp, the people that go to Theology Beer Camp are people that like being nerdy. They like enjoying craft beer or hanging out with people that do. There are non-beer options, don't worry. And there are people who questioning and challenging their faith and thinking it through, and doubts and stuff are like signs of health. And so when you get in a community where between stuff and in small groups, all that kind of stuff, you get to talk, hang out, and say it all, it's a really affirmative experience. Because I think a lot of us in our church and our family, friends and stuff, there's always just a few people where you get to be on the reels with. Because when you start asking questions, then they're like, what? Don't say that. I might admit I've thought that before too, And so yeah, that's kind of the most important, I think the most enjoyable part is meeting people in your area, people around the country that are on that wavelength. And it's also an opportunity, to have more fun than you're supposed to have as an adult, because we are trying to craft an experience that brings the best parts of the craziest party you had in college, the best youth group retreat. If you went to seminary, that one seminary class where you learned a lot, but it wasn't because you just read books, but because the conversation and the professor and everything was awesome. And then at the very end, there might even be a revival service where where I said things that I'm not sure should go on the internet, but
yeah, it's what a combination though.
Yeah,
college party, youth group, and seminary class, like
and a revival.
And a revival. I mean,
yeah,
I don't know of anything else like that.
I don't. So Theology Beer Camp, and now
the one, the only.
Yeah. Prepare yourself, John Cobb.
Are you going to say any more? Or am I on?
I don't need to introduce you.
Okay.
I've been introducing you since I met you.
You are a remarkably obedient group. I don't know whether you obey anybody else, but at least you obey Tripp Fuller. While you were hearing about a wonderful trip, at first I was looking up in my date book to see if I could squeeze in something else, because there's a meeting in the Azores, which is not an unpleasant place to go, from July 25th to 28th, the 11th International Whitehead Conference. Love to have you come for that also. Well, thank you for this opportunity. I don't think that I grew up expecting to be at a beer festival, but if they were all like this, then I think I would transfer from the Methodist Church to the beer community. A few days ago, I met a very interesting young man who is an Afro-Brazilian. I think that the language one uses, who had discovered process thought. He told me that he had been going to school and studying science, and then he found Jesus. And when he found Jesus, he gave his life to Jesus. And then his teachers told him, the teachers of the faith, the Baptist teachers, told him that he would need to give up science. So he gave up science. Then he discovered that there were ways in which you could be both a scientist and a faithful follower of Jesus. And he had learned that in relationship to what he heard about process theology. And so he wanted to learn more about process theology. Well, I think it's a tragic situation in which people think that following Jesus and learning what science can teach and what we can learn from science is a necessary choice. And because I live in a liberal context, all of my liberal friends are likely to say, tut, tut, it's those bad fundamentalists. I am myself inclined to say, tut, tut, it's those bad scientists. And not many people understand why one should be tut-tutting in this kind of way about science. But I have become truly distressed by the developments of the last 50 years in relationship to our educational system. Throughout history, education and the institutions that promoted education have been seeking to open people's minds, of course to provide information, but to help people to understand how to put together what we might simplify by saying facts and values. In fact, the whole idea of separating facts and values as two separate spheres of inquiry is a very recent development in the history of education. And I think that the fact that universities now pride themselves on saying that they are value-free. And they're rather accurate in describing themselves in that way. They think values are not significant, that they are not true and false, that there is no real better and worse. and the abolishing of value concerns from education is a horrible loss. Now, I'm also critical of fundamentalism. I don't mean to say that fundamentalists are right about all the things that they do. I'm just saying I think that the teaching of the university is worse than the teaching of the fundamentalists, and that therefore whereas in general in our culture, the fundamentalists are criticized right and left all the time. Universities are still exalted as places of knowledge. I'm afraid some people still say places of wisdom, but they are not seeking wisdom anymore. So in the book that is sort of vaguely the background of what I'm saying, I do spend a little time talking about these matters and how they came to be, but I have more passion in trying to generate a realistic picture of what our schooling is doing to people. I think it is encouraging meaninglessness, confusion, chaos, and it is encouraging a devaluation of what is most important to be valued, namely values. I'll very briefly sketch the history of how this came into being, because if we know how something came into being, we may be able to get some handles on how to begin to change it. And I do think there are possibilities of changing it. This is a recent development in the history of schooling, not something that has been, so that changing a recent development does not have quite the problematic character that changing something that has always been the case does. Okay. Now, René Descartes is almost universally recognized as the creator of modern philosophy. And modern philosophy is very closely connected with modern science. And both are very closely connected with modern education. So the ideas of Descartes have played a central role in the transformation from medieval to modern thought. Now, Descartes had good reasons for taking the positions he took, and they have had some good effects. I hope I don't sound like I'm demonizing Descartes or saying he didn't have a positive contribution to make. But the net effect, on the one hand, has been to generate an enormous amount of scientific knowledge and technological development, but on the other hand, to separate human beings from values beyond the value of money and prestige and things of that kind. Now, the crucial step that Descartes took was to say we should not ever introduce the idea of purpose or indeed anything subjective into the explanation of the natural world. He was convinced that the natural world is purely physical and operates on purely mechanistic principles. This was a reaction against the Aristotelian science of the medieval period. Aristotle, generally recognized as the best scientific thinker of the ancient world, was recognized in that way by the medieval scholars, and so they greatly admired and appreciated him. But as almost always happens when we celebrate somebody's thinking, we may shift a little bit the pattern of emphasis. So medieval Aristotelianism was in its scientific work overwhelmingly focused on what Aristotle called final causes. That means purposes, goals, aims. And when the medieval scientist was studying the human body, they came across an organ. The question they asked was, what is the function of that organ in the body? And when they had figured out what it was there for, they felt they had an adequate understanding of it. Now, Descartes thought that blocked the more serious questions of explaining how it worked. So once you know that the function of the heart has to do with the circulation of the blood, etc., you stop studying it. He said, no, it's a pump, and you've got to figure out how the pump is operating. The pump is a mechanical thing, and you need to understand the physical causes that are making it function the way it does. And it turned out, unquestionably, that science went much deeper, became much more powerful and significant as a result of ignoring or even explicitly rejecting any subjective aspect of nature. Now that meant nature has no values in itself. Nature has value only insofar it has value for human beings. Now, Descartes was very sure that human beings are not part of that nature. Our bodies are. But our souls, our psyches, our minds are emphatically not part of that nature. So Descartes did not do away with values. Descartes was a theist. He believed in all kinds of things that he got from the Catholic Church. He was a devoted member of the Catholic Church. So I hope I can making clear his views were radically anthropocentric, and it was the natural world, everything except the human soul, that was understood as this great machine. Well, the next development of great importance for what I'm now talking about, skipping over all kinds of things that are relevant, was the discovery that we are part of nature. Now that I associate, or I think we all associate, primarily with Darwin. Darwin was the one who demonstrated, I think decisively, unquestionably, that we are products of the natural world. Well, if we are part of nature, then there are two choices. One choice is to say, in that case, Descartes was wrong about nature. We need to rethink what nature is. If we are part of nature, we know that purposes play a role in nature. Our purposes do. The purposes of scientists play a large role in reshaping the world, and creating technology, etc., etc. We know that Descartes was wrong in thinking that animals have no subjective experience. Now, Descartes thought it was all right to engage in vivisection, and you didn't have to be concerned about the fact that the dog you were cutting in pieces was suffering, because it's just like a squeaking door when the dog complains. But now we would say the same thing then is either true of human beings or it's false of dogs. In my view, common sense teaches that nature is not like Descartes said it was. Nature is not simply mechanical. Living things could never be adequately understood as machines. Especially animals cannot, and we especially as human beings cannot. So from my point of view, that is the right move to have made. And there were a lot of people who thought so, and went to work to rethink nature. There was a generation in which the educational system was quite open to these reflections. Now, many of you know that the single figure who I think did the best job of rethinking the natural world was Alfred North Whitehead. But Henri Bergson and William James and John Dewey and C.S. Peirce and scores of other people were on that side of the argument. And that side of the argument could enrich colleges that were involved in the liberal arts. There would be a shift in the way biology would be taught. Instead of teaching biology simply in terms of mechanism, you could take seriously that living things acted in ways that inanimate objects don't. And there's a lot of evidence for that. So this is not to be less scientific, it's really to be more scientific, to pay more attention to the facts and the evidence. Sadly, from my point of view, after a generation in which it really seemed that the new naturalism, the one that took all the dimensions of human experience seriously, had a chance of transforming education in one way, the opposite choice was made in the university world and has reshaped schools. So that now value-free teaching is, and that means not only you don't have a distorted perspective, but also you don't talk about values, has affected the whole schooling system. Now, I still believe there is a chance to reverse that decision. That's maybe an act of faith. I don't believe anybody really believes that human beings are nothing but machines, physical machines. The word zombie is the accurate word to use to describe what the university teaches us that we are. But I don't believe anyone who is teaching us that we are zombies really believes that we are zombies. Well, I think even universities might pay some attention to the need to be consistent between what we say we believe and what we really believe. I can be very cynical about this because I see so many people who are so good at claiming they believe things that they actually don't believe. But I think that it does generate an internal problem in the lives and thinking of many, many professors. I think also that physics, like many physicists, would like to have a consistent physics. But now they don't, because they discover that the quanta out of which the whole world is made are not like they're supposed to be in order to support the mechanistic physics. So if the very most foundational part of physics doesn't agree with the rest of physics, there's a chance that people would rethink the rest of physics to make it conform to the fundamental rather than just say, well, this is anomalous. Well, I could go on this topic a long time, but I do want to say that I would love to enlist you in my campaign against the modern educational, and again, I really don't like to say educational, schooling system. It's the way schooling has been institutionalized, I think, leads to consequences that are very, very serious. Existentially or sociologically, we have a huge problem that the only value that people are encouraged to have is the value of making money or gaining status and better positions in society. You cannot build a democracy on that. You cannot build a sustainable society on that. And to invest huge quantities and to channel so many of the best thinkers, morally good people also, into communicating that which is destructive of the human spirit, I think is a crime against us all, and I don't want to be silent about it. Okay. So, how can that be changed? Well, I will say one great hope came to me when the Pope spoke out in a brilliant and beautiful encyclical, Laudato Si. Laudato Si says, we must integrate our knowledge of the world. Ignacio wants you to look at a book he brought. Okay. But we must integrate our knowledge of the world scientifically with our concern for the poor. And that means we must integrate also our concern for the sustainability of the planet physically, which is a very different matter, with our concern for justice in human relations. It's called integral ecology. That's the language that he uses. Now, we have been using the language which we actually got from China of ecological civilization, but we mean the same thing. Basically, we mean a different way of organizing our lives that will bring about a healthier society based on community and justice, and at the same time will not continue to destroy the natural context in which we live. Now, this is a value-filled vision. If you subscribe to those values, you still need a huge amount of information of the sort that we need the scientists to help us get. This is not a rejection of interest in science at all. But it does mean that scientists need to think about what they are studying with concerns for sustainability and with concerns for how human beings and the rest of the natural world should be integrated with each other. And with openness to learning about the rich values that nature has and how they're related with the rich values that human life has. And this would be a deep change from the way in which the educational system has been shaped in recent years. Now, I think this change can happen. I hope I'm not just crying in the wilderness. I think it is a wilderness and I'm crying, so I guess I am crying in a wilderness. But I'm hoping that it can make contact with where a great many people in higher education already are. I think thousands of teachers would like for their work to be truly beneficial for their students and for the wider society. And right now, if you ask what is the basic effect of the universities, the research that they're doing, has very, very little to do with the real needs of a world that is heading for self-destruction. Only a few places. The weather, the students of weather, climate, I think they are helping us. So I don't mean there's no help, but it has very little to do with what's taught in economics department. In the economics department, they're still telling us the one goal we have is to increase market activity. That means using up the resources of the earth faster. That's got to be changed. Okay, the hope that I have is first of all for Catholic universities. Catholic universities have never claimed or asserted that they are value-free, but they've gotten most of their professors from universities that train the professors to be value-free. So I don't think that you could say they have fully escaped. But at the same time, since they officially do not accept that goal, and since they want to support what the Pope claims he's for, I think there's a chance that they may actually lead a profound reformation of higher education. We are now working on 140 Catholic university presidents signed a document saying they wanted to support Laudato Si. How much has happened, I don't know. But we're going to do our best to get them to act on what they said they wanted to act on. And it's doable. I'm not asking for something that we can't give any specific indication of how to affect. Now, of course, the book that I have written, and Tripp is partly responsible for the book's existence, so it fits very well with this context, is on the theological side, although I think what I've been talking about is theological. My view of theology is very broad. I define, when I found out that theology as an academic discipline doesn't seem to have much relevance to what goes on in the world, I decided that wasn't the theology I wanted to teach. So I redefined theology. Actually, all I did was to go back to the really traditional understanding of theology. I think theology is thinking about important questions from a consciously Christian perspective. I think what I've been saying about higher education is a Christian comments about higher education. And I think higher education and the whole of education is an important question. So that's what Augustine did. That's what Thomas did. That's what the Reformers did. Although the Reformers tended somewhat to narrow the scope, they were all too ready to sort of separate the theological from the scientific, and that came to be the way in which Protestants have largely dealt with these problems. Okay. So, if we then say theology can also include reflection about itself and about its own tradition, then we have to say, okay, living in a world of desperate need, a world in which what Christianity has become to all too great an extent is simply incredible and often damaging and destructive, then what one who really wants to be a Christian needs to do is also critique and evaluate the Christian tradition. When I turned my attention to trying to do that, one of the first things that strikes me is that very little attention in Christian theology is paid to Jesus. Now, that may be a very strange thing to say. We think of all of the Christological creeds and all that. That is a way of attending to Jesus, but it's not a way of actually trying to understand who Jesus was and what Jesus taught and what Jesus believed and what Jesus wanted people to do. So when I say the lack of attention to Jesus, it's that kind of concern. I believe that in the Gospels, in the Synoptic Gospels at least, God speaks directly only twice. You may find something that I've missed, but at the time of the baptism, God announces that this is God's beloved Son. And then in the Transfiguration, God again speaks. This time, after he says, "This is my beloved Son," God says, "Listen to him." Well, that seems reasonable. But the church has rather systematically avoided doing that for a long time. If you listen to Jesus, you won't focus your attention upon sexuality. He has a remarkable little to say about that topic. You will focus a lot of attention upon money. Yeah, Jesus had a lot to say about money. He said, you cannot serve both God and money. That's a kind of quick summary. Well, it's fairly obvious that our society and modernity in general and the educational system have decided to serve money and not God. And it's distressing to me that the church has not been a little bit critical of that. You would think if we were at all interested in Jesus, we would not want a society totally devoted to the service of what is incompatible. In the Methodist Church, we have a horrible addition to the creed that got in rather unfortunate circumstances, which says homosexuality, the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with the Christian faith. And we've been struggling to try to get that out for a long time. But I would say that the quest for more and more money is incompatible with the Christian faith. At least it's incompatible with the teaching of Jesus. Now, you can define the Christian faith in a way that has nothing whatsoever to do with the teaching of Jesus. Then I'm not a Christian. I don't want to be that kind of Christian. But if we pay no attention to Jesus, the claim that we are worshiping him is a very strange claim to me. Okay, if we do pay attention to Jesus, then I think that will lead us to think of God in a different way. And of course, the book, Jesus Abba, is primarily a book about God. I decided I would not spend my time just repeating what I had said in the book. But it is significant that the only word in Aramaic for God, for Father, not for God, is Abba. And so when Jesus speaks to God and about God, he uses the language of Abba. I grew up calling my father, and as long as he lived, I called him Papa. And you understand, Papa and Abba are slightly different forms of what people hear babies, the sounds that babies make. And I learned recently that Koreans also call Father Abba, so that this way of hearing babies speak is not limited to a few languages. Okay. I think if we ask the question, what connotations does it have when we use that kind of language, we would not have fallen into the traps that we did fall into. From my point of view, one of the first major traps that has profoundly changed the understanding of God from Jesus' understanding is the attribution to God of omnipotence. Now, my great opposition to what I was calling the modern worldview is that it makes the physical world omnipotent. Everything is explained by physics. Ultimately, we will reduce biology to a branch of physics and so forth and so on. I think to say that there is one cause of everything that happens, whether it's the physical world or God, is totally inconsistent with our actual human experience. And since the Bible does not teach it, unfortunately, the Latin translation of a proper name for God does introduce Almighty. And But once that idea that God is almighty or omnipotent got into the liturgical life of the church, it has become more important theologically to many, many Christians than anything Jesus said or did. To me, to base the whole of theology upon a misrepresenting element of Jerome's translation is a horrible travesty and distortion, and we should be working systematically to free ourselves. Just as I said, no one really believes that we are zombies. No one really believes that they are automata. But if we have no power whatsoever, we are automata. God does everything. So the most vicious acts that human beings perform are just as much the acts of God as are the greatest expressions of human love. I don't think anybody believes that. Really, I hope not. But nevertheless, we teach it. Since it's not biblical, since it's incredible, since it has damaged a great many people, and today is a huge obstacle to getting thoughtful people to pay attention to Christian teaching, I don't think it's a minor matter that we expose it and find that we can speak of the power of God. We must speak of the power of God. But the power of God is the power of love. It is not the power of control. Of course, God does many things. But God does not control us. God lures us. God calls us. God urges us. God empowers us. God does all sorts of things. All sorts of things that are excluded in principle once you have adopted the modern, Cartesian worldview and extended it to human beings. But then to say, because God does many things, that God does everything, it just doesn't make sense, and it is terribly damaging. There are other steps that we have taken along the way that have made Christianity less promising, less hopeful for the world, which have distracted us from the real task of being servants of God, being faithful to Jesus. But I won't try to get into them. I am deeply convinced that there is no real problem in being deeply faithful to Jesus and believing in the God that Jesus witnessed to and believed in and lived for, and at the same time being completely open-minded, much more open than science has become, to all the evidence that we can possibly get. That is, to me, good news. We don't have to live the lie. Either the lie that the churches have so often promoted, or the lie that the modern world affirms. We can live the truth. Let's vow to do that. Thank you.
The church has let Caesar, who builds crosses, take our doctrine and redefine the terms, and then hands it back to us.
So I was taking some notes, and I thought, as someone who's not nearly as nice as Cobb, I would make sarcastic comments towards my friends in other podcasts and tell you what John Cobb, if he was as day drinking and snarky as me, wanted to say. Wesley was processed. He would have been processed if he had just lived long enough, because he liked science and he loved people around him, learned his faith from his mom, and stuck to love. He's processed. If you want to stay back in the day, go for it, but it sucks. Second, creeds suck. Third, They don't suck as bad back then than they did today, but the problem is when they invented creeds, it taught you to read the story of Jesus and edit out everything Jesus said and did in his entire ministry that got his ass killed. My name is John Cobb. My initials are JC. And if you want to talk about the kingdom of God, then you should probably actually talk about what he did. I'm not trying to be mean to you. You probably read too much Bart. But the divinity of Jesus is not a negation of his humanity, but it's the fullness of his humanity. And his humanity's fullness is in the fullness of all the diversity of the world, because the world is the body of God. Second, or two more points, economism is a global religion. It's more effective than Christianity because it convinces everyone to do what's at the heart of it. I was trying to peer pressure some Christians to act like Jesus. Last bit, God's relational. That's because God's loving. And every time the church is attempted to make God less relational, they veer off basic biblical Christianity. Last part was, dude, I'm just pretty sure that Cobb again quoted more Bible verses. And the fact that anyone would choose to be an economist just to undermine the profit motive and the fact that the variable, the economy and economism don't pay attention to is fucking over the earth is amazeballs. So since John Cobb is basically a theological bodhisattva, then maybe he'll come back. That was a hashtag shout out to his interreligious dialogue. Awesome. So, the last keg that is for Beer Camp just got tapped. It is the Endless Rant IPA from King Harbor Brewing Company. It was made when Phil, who's a friend of mine and Brian's, Phil also hooked me up with the Belgian yeast strain from the brewery when he used to brew there. And I brewed all my same recipes for Belgian beers for like 9 months and placed a lot because I got to use the brewery yeast. So I love Phil. Anyway, he made this beer for Adam Carolla because Adam likes to go in. And he said that, hey, Adam, you realize you're not on a podcast now, so you don't have to keep ranting at me. I'm going to pour someone else a drink. And so he made an endless rant. And then Phil's like, oh, all the podcast people are going to hang out and y'all are going to have beer. You actually talk more than Adam does, so you should have endless rant. So it's not a widely distributed IPA, so you should have some. Oh, y'all are already up here, so, but I'm vamping because I had three what Cobb didn't say comments. You know, Nathan, this is a sign of affection to passive aggressively say things. One, Cobb wanted to pause, but it would have been a PhD seminar to tell Christians to stop letting David Hume define what a miracle is. David Hume shouldn't define it. And you know why? Because David Hume had a picture of the world in which God and the world are separate. That's stupid. It's not biblical. It's not scientific. It's not smart. So suck it, David Hume. And Christian theologians that keep using David Hume's definition of the miracle should go to hell, but John doesn't believe in hell because God's almost as nice as John is. Second, there is violence in the Bible. Liberals edit out miracles out of the Bible. Conservatives edit out basically everything Jesus asked, talked about, and did, and everything that got him killed. What does a process person suggest we edit out? When there's a worship song that includes killing kids. I'm just saying, if there are only 3 options, I would go for the one that edits out violence to children. Remember, you just saw my child. Cora was playing. Hashtag team process. Hashtag I'm not against baby killing. All right. Then there's a number of discussion about education. And Cobb's just trying to say that education is formation. And that if you are in the discipline of educating people, you should actually care about how the knowledge materializes things in the world for other people. Guess what, people that are ordained? That's what a fucking sermon is. And if you want people in their vocations to actually embody goodness, then maybe you might want to call economism out as a world religion that's killing the poor and pillaging the planet in your sermon next week. And if you don't, just tell us who you really work for. Hashtag capitalism. Hashtag de-Trump. All right. I'm not saying that Cobb actually would have ever said those things. I'm just saying It's okay. He nodded to hashtag D-Trump because that's a double meaning. Anyway, alas, lament psalms are in the Bible. I'm really tired of quoting the Bible to people who think I don't read it. Lament psalms have the possibility of being honest about our experience. It's very good. I'm fully relational, that you should be able to be honest about your experience to God without thinking God thinks you're talking about metaphysics. Honestly, Christians, y'all get really worked up. You can tell the truth about your experience in any moment. God will not freak out. Also, God does not have to follow all of your assumptions. Maybe you should move along and realize that lament psalms give us the possibility of being honest about reality and are unrelated to whether or not everything that happened in the world is connected to the omnipotent phallic symbol in the sky. And the last thing that I noticed is that Cobb, unlike a Christian humanist, really wants to believe in the resurrection. And, I just want to pause with that because I've been at a lot of conferences at Claremont with process people. And we should just, for a second, hashtag Cobby Lobby, know that moment where the process person's like, I don't want to give no ghost account of the resurrection. And you may be saying to yourself, what? Is Cobb going to try to argue for resuscitation of a corpse? No, he's intelligent. You want to know why? Because it's non-theological for a Christian to want to talk about the resurrection that doesn't include God giving life to material existence. And if you think the new life God gives needs a dead Jew who is fully faithful to Abba for it to be true, then you have a really small view of the resurrection. John Cobb is 100% confident that no matter what just happened, the God who is love is present and shares what happened and offers new creation to it in each moment with possibility. And if you think that is a liberal, wussy version of the resurrection, then hashtag D-Trump. But if you were wondering what John Cobb was thinking during that last discussion, he was like, yeah, I'm a Methodist missionary kid. How many of you went to another continent for Jesus? You should take this shit more seriously. I like brew theology. Your questions are excellent. And I don't even like beer. Okay, maybe it's because I was kind of like, I don't know, the OG for Christian Buddhist dialogue. But when are people going to stop acting like learning from other world religions is weird? I thought they were Christians. Christianity is an entire religion based on a Jew. You have to at least learn from two religions not to be a Marcionite, which is a heretic. Well, surprisingly, evangelicals only ask me about passages from the New Testament. But I'm too Wesleyan to make that point right now, so I'm just going to move along. Oh, wait, there was that one that asked me about killing kids in the Old Testament. Whoops. Could for a second, I have an excursus for at least an hour to explain why the biggest problem with West-East dialogue is that Christians and Jews and Muslims are insistent that there's only one absolute. That's ridiculous. God and creativity, aka you have to read Whitehead, they're different absolutes. And I'm not telling you, Christians, that you have to admit that creativity is another absolute. I'm just telling you that until you allow the East to speak wisdom to us that isn't secretly what we already know, then you're going to be jerks to large portions of the world. Second, isn't it weird that a religion that's based on the product of God lovingly relating to a covenantal partner and that births a completely different religion is surprised that God has completely different wisdom that bubbles up in other parts of the globe in different continents and different cultures? That is so freaking weird. Why can't God always be relating and loving the world as it is and bringing all sorts of different multiplicity, diversities of awesome sauce into existence? Jesus Christ loves everybody. Omnipotence. This is the point where Tripp was thinking about making a babysitter reference joke, but I knew that Dan from Brew Theology was making comments on Twitter prior to this event that at some point I would talk about how an omnipotent deity I would not let babysit. So I'm not talking about that right now. Oops, Tripp. Cobb didn't say that. You should keep paying attention. Dude, creeds suck. I don't know why Cobb can't just say this more directly. Maybe it's because I'm a Baptist and he's a Methodist. And honestly, anyone that ever reads a creed to me reminds me that creeds were created in a conclave by an empire. Now, creeds obeyed imperial necessity and were made in a conclave. Does anything in charge of it by an imperial dictator who also put people on crosses in case they crossed his ass in a conclave full of a bunch of celibate men who could not embrace the full body and enjoyment God made them? Would you really want to trust them to explain the incarnation? I don't know if I would. Hashtag some say. Why do people get so obsessed with giving Christians more rules about things Jesus wasn't into? For real, dude. I swear, I feel bad every time I hang out with evangelicals who are more concerned with what their penis did when they were 13 than they are about the poor and the planet. You know what's weird is they get obsessed about these new rules Jesus wasn't worried about and then ignored almost everything he cared about. How does that make sense? Oh, my bad. I read 2 Corinthians. If anything's inerrant, it's the Quran. I say that as a biblical Christian. That's because I actually let other religions tell me who they are, and I'm going to attempt to tell Christians who Jesus was.